Hi, I'm OC Hall. I am currently engaged in a study of the study of Black history. And when I dig in and do my research, I find some very amazing things. We're in modern times now, we are hearing a lot of challenges uh, by people who are claiming that they are Black Aboriginal Native Americans. They're challenging the narrative of slavery and challenging the history, saying that it comes from YT sources and that it's all fake. Well, let's go back and take a look at this claim, which I state at the outset is a false claim. We can go back and we can see the writing of Gustavus Vasa in the 1700s. And Gustavus Vasa actually wrote uh, a autobiography about his life and his experience of being taken into slavery. He talks about the last time he saw his sister when him and his sister were separated when they were both taken into slavery. We have reports of the experience of traveling on the slave ship. We look at Phyllis Wheatley and her report, her personal report done in her own writings during the 1700s. We see the writings of Benjamin Banneker in the 1700s, where he writes a letter ultimately to um, Thomas Jefferson, and in it he states that I am of the African race. We see the writings of David Walker and his famous appeal to the colored people of the world. And he's encouraging rebellion against slavery. And in it, he describes himself as a son of Africa. Um, we can look at the extensive writings of Martin Delany and some of the descriptions that he gave, some of the history that he gave, going all the way back into ancient Egypt. And prior to the um, Emancipation Proclamation, the first Civil War, there was about 40 Black newspapers that were published. And these 40 Black newspapers, such as Freedom's Journal, and they set forth information, about our history and our experiences. They talked about current happenings that was going on within the community that impacted Africans and African achievements. And so, in other words, the history is so well documented by Black people without using any YT sources at all. We have the bulk of Black history emerges from the hands of Black writers. In addition to that, there's an old tradition in the Black community where our history has been passed down in many families from one generation to the next. There were families who were embarrassed about being African, who had been uh, persecuted because of their African heritage, and many of them sought to deny being African and sought to hide it from even from their children, so that because they didn't want to suffer. And so, this is a real part of our heritage. It's a real part of our history, but there are just too many cases of the history being passed down from one generation to the next, and people following up on it and documenting and collecting artifacts and family records and establishing history through documents. If you look at course of business documents for activities that were going on, like the slave trade created course of business documents because there were business transactions that were documents. There were sales that were documented. There were uh, port records from the delivery of cargoes and the the travel manifests and all those things. All these things are artifacts and records. In addition to that, there's records where slave ships were actually built, and there are investors, people who invested. There's financial transactions. There's business records from banks and insurance companies where insurance claims were filed. So these are all uh, business records that are source information that establish what happened in the history of Black people. So, in terms of looking at this, we go to bring ourselves into the 20th century, and we find actually J.A. Rogers starts writing in the late 1900s. So does W.E.B. Du Bois, and we see them beginning to document Black history and share information. So we also have Walter White writing about lynching and what happened. We have Carter G. Woodson actually start a organization uh, to document Black history and to create a journal that documented Black history and that continues to do so. And so, in terms of looking at, like for example, Black Scholar was a publication that that documented Black history, that documented sociological studies, that documented Black psychology. Then there's the Journal of Black Psychology, the Journal of Black Sociology. There's the Journal of African Civilizations. There's the Crisis Magazine that was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. There's Marcus Garvey had a newspaper that published and documented history. When we actually get into it and we see so many different sources, and then we get into, like, for example, you have Dr. John Henry Clark, you have, um, uh, uh, you just have so many John Hope Franklin, you have LaRon Bennett, even Alex Haley, and you begin to take a look at and you see Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan, Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, you see Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. You have so many different writers, Chancellor Williams, and who wrote about our history, who documented our history, who went to primary sources, and who brought forth the evidence. Most of the scholars, when they challenged um, the tenets of YT supremacy, there was pushback. So they fought and challenged a system that was in place that was anti-Black, and they were able to produce documents and records and to be able to make arguments and bring forth information to document and push back against the destructive narrative that was against the interests of Black people. And so, when we look at this thing and we look at the libraries that were created and how Black people realized how important it was to create libraries and to be able to um, to create the documentation and be able to preserve that documentation for the next generations to come. So we have the first African American History Museum started at Hampton Institute in at Hampton University, and we have uh, museums develop all across the country where Black people are preserving their history. They're writing about what happened. They're writing about their experiences. You have a whole generations, multiple generations of Black journalists who come forward and who document contemporaneously what's going on and who write down the history as it's happening. And so, in terms of people that are saying that, all our history, is false and comes from YT sources, they're completely disingenuous, and they really don't deserve to be regarded at all, because they are promoting a destructive narrative within our community, and they undermine the progress of Black America. And so it's critical for us um, to recognize the sources of of Black history and the work that Black scholars have put into um, uh, developing this history and documenting it, writing it down, and transmitting it from one generation to the next. And so um, this is a proud tradition of Black people who, excuse me, have worked diligently to make sure that our history is well documented and preserved and passed down from one generation to the next. I often talk about Miss Pauline Young. When she was over 100 years old, she invited me to her house to look at her collection. She wanted to give me her collection. And ultimately, I was not able to take in the responsibility for such a collection. And it is now at the University of Delaware, in the Pauline Young collection at the University of Delaware. But her entire house, every wall in her house had bookshelves on it, except the bathroom and the kitchen. And she had collected books her entire life on Black history. And so she had a vast collection of history, of Black history books, primarily written by Black writers. And she had articles and all kinds of information that had been created by Black people in order to transmit that history from one generation to the next. And she was a librarian for her career, and she retired, and then she continued to collect Black history information her entire life. And then, that information is now housed at the University of Delaware in the Pauline Young collection. In addition to that, Charles Bloxham collected over 500,000 books and artifacts and documents that are part of Black history, of a vast Black history collection now housed at Temple University. And there are other examples of this all around the country where there were Black scholars, there were Black librarians, there were people who collected artifacts, who collected Black art, who collected the writings. You look at the Harlem Renaissance period, and you look at all of the writings that were created during the Harlem Renaissance period, poetry, history, short stories, and novels and music, and the essence of Black culture was captured and recorded for posterity. And so, in terms of just looking at where we are as far as our history and understanding that when people say that, well, we don't believe it. We don't believe that there was slavery, and they tell you that Egypt is in America, and they say some other ridiculous kinds of things. We should be comforted in knowing our history. And some of those people you may be able to convince, some of them are so lost there's nothing really you could do. They're just lost. And unfortunately, in every generation, there are some that are lost and who will never find their way, and who will always be outside, and who will work against the interests of the Black community. Even during slavery, when Harriet Tubman tried to bring people to freedom, there were people who resisted. They didn't want to be free. They didn't want to know the truth. They didn't want to move forward. They wanted to stay where they were. And so this has been part of our history, and it has always been a part of our history. So we're always going to have those that are working against the interests of the Black community that are within our own community. And so we have to recognize and understand that this is just part of the process. And we have to continue to struggle and keep moving forward, and keep struggling in order to continue to make progress. And if we look at our history, we've continued to progress in every generation. And no matter how hard they try to set us back and push us backward, we always persevere, and we continue to break through and move forward and continue to progress and move into the future successfully. So with that, thank you very much for listening and think on these things.